Good evening, and happy Mother's Day. What does the light of the sunset do to the appearance of the saucers? Does it cause them to morph into giant, alien, robot, monster, ghost, vampire, shark, dino, spider, flies? Or does it cause them to melt and fall to the ground in the shape of a crop circle? These are the only two possibilities. Auroras were seen across large portions of the northern and southern hemispheres. Or are the auroras just an internet conspiracy? And you know what they say, every time there's a sky jelly sighting, a producer in LA self-actualizes. Plus, a case of craft-like UFO launching from a rural country road? And are some saucers really just sea foam? What if sea foam became the new saucers? All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Jeff Knox.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
Welcome to Ufo Sunset. And now, for the rebrief. People captured a spiral in the sky caused by a Falcon 9 launch. In early May, people throughout much of the Northern Hemisphere witnessed and captured videos of 2 Falcon 9 rocket launches, with some calling what they saw a UFO. The rockets launched from Vandenberg Space Force Base May 2nd. One launched in the afternoon was captured by people in California, the Southwest, and Northern Europe that evening. A witness wrote, quote, "Somebody, please tell me this isn't a UFO. Completely clear skies and I see a super blurry white light, no flashes like a plane, coming straight at me horizontally. It then goes straight up and freaking disappears. Checked and there were no rocket launches or anything like that. Either way, a rocket would have emitted a different color light. I was able to get this much on camera. Someone explain, please," unquote. The New York Post reported that Ukrainian space watching group Alpha Centauri also captured the second Falcon 9 launch. They wrote on Twitter, quote, "Over some regions of the country, the second stage of the Falcon 9 carrier could be seen launching 2 Worldview Legion satellites," unquote. Rare, nearly worldwide auroras happened last night. The sun's activity has rapidly increased in recent days with the growth of the sunspot AR3664, which last week jumped in size to over 15 times the size of the Earth's diameter, viewable using only a solar eclipse viewer or solar eclipse glasses. This has led to multiple X-class flares and also multiple coronal mass ejections or CMEs. While the solar flares reach Earth within minutes and can cause radio blackouts and interference to machines in space, CMEs arrive at the planet in a matter of hours to days. They cause geomagnetic storms that can result in auroras, as well as effects to both space machines and power and communication grids here on Earth. A CME that reached Earth on Friday resulted in the most powerful geomagnetic storm since 2003, with auroras visible in all 50 states, even faintly in Hawaii, as well as far south as Mexico, Africa, India, the Bahamas, and in the southern hemisphere, aurora australis was seen across New Zealand and Australia. These auroras were visible in a wide range of colors, including green, purple, gray, blue, brilliant red, and brilliant magenta. The geomagnetic storm was rated as a G5, which is extreme, and the highest rating on the scale. Because of additional CMEs, the NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center forecasts more auroras tonight and tomorrow. There have also been a number of solar flares, with 5 X-class flares having occurred since Thursday evening. The most powerful of these, on Saturday, was rated at X 5.89. This most recent ongoing solar storm is a part of the solar maximum of solar cycle 25, an approximately 11-year cycle that the sun's weather goes through. The sun's weather is expected to become more turbulent and violent over the coming months, which means that there will probably be more geomagnetic storms and auroras throughout much of 2024, and they will likely be more powerful than usual. The NASA MAVEN, or Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution spacecraft, captured hemisphere-spanning auroras on Mars 3 times this February. Space weather reported in April. Sorry, I'm having trouble with this video. Can y'all hear me? Anyway, these auroras on Mars took place on February 3rd through 5th, February 7th through 10th, and February 15th through 16th. Martian auroras are only visible in the ultraviolet spectrum, which means that they're invisible to the human eye. Normally, Martian auroras only happen in small regions of the planet where localized magnetic fields are generated in the planet's surface. But these instances of global auroras are new, arriving with increased solar activity earlier in the year. MAVEN's imaging ultraviolet spectrograph team lead, Nick Schneider, described the globe-spanning auroras on Mars as a quote-unquote Martian hat trick. A member of the MAVEN Solar Energy Particle team, Rebecca Jolitz, said, quote, "Mars is currently getting hit by roughly 1 to 2 CMEs every month," unquote. The first varied bunting record in Wisconsin marks the 3rd in eastern North America. The varied bunting was spotted by a Milwaukee Journal Sentinel editor, Bob Dorr, and 2 others on the morning of May 4th on a bluff at Lion's Den Gorge Nature Preserve in Grafton, Wisconsin. A group of around 20 birders also observed the bird that afternoon. The varied bunting is normally mostly native to Mexico. The sighting is confirmed. The sighting is the first confirmed sighting in Wisconsin, according to Mark Korticke from the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, with only 2 previous confirmed sightings in eastern North America, one from Ontario, Canada, and one from Pennsylvania. The Wisconsin sighting is the farthest north that the varied bunting has been sighted. Quote, "The varied bunting is the latest in a wave of first-ever bird species sightings in Wisconsin. In the last 12 months, the list includes the flame-colored tanager, American flamingo, ancient merlet, and fieldfare," unquote. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel reported last Sunday. According to Tom Presby from Audubon, the varied bunting sighted in Wisconsin was likely blown by strong Midwestern winds and weather in recent weeks. And now for Mr. Jeff Knox.
About the South Hill, Virginia crater incident. South Hill was, let me just, can you make that bigger, Rachel? I don't know how to make it bigger. Okay. So South Hill was a small tobacco town of about 3,000 people in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. It's located just north of the North Carolina border. I'm just going to give you a little map details here to keep in mind real quick before I go over this. This is an aerial image that contains a modern satellite image of the area, and I overlaid it with a 1967 aerial image. That red dot is where this object landed, and the burn marks are. That square box is where this warehouse that I'll be telling you guys about is. And this is just kind of a drawn map. Again, you see the warehouse down there on the bottom right, and these wheat fields and these various streets and where the burn mark occurred. But let's get over the description here. So it's about 5 minutes before 9 p.m., and it's April 21st, 1967. Clifton N. Crowder, manager of the Mobile Chemical Company warehouse in South Hill, Virginia, has been alone at the office for the last few hours going over the plant's books. He decides to call it a night and heads to his car to drive home. Again, there's the warehouse and this little road here. As he starts home, he heads up the warehouse's red clay driveway until it intersects with East Farrell Street. East Farrell Street is a paved road that heads into town to the west. As he barely starts down this road, he's only about 50 to 75 yards down the road when his headlights fall upon an object about 400 feet away, blocking his path. This object he describes as dull aluminum, shaped like a storage tank, about 12 feet in diameter. It's about 15 to 16 feet high, and he says it kind of looks like the nitrogen tank near the fertilizer warehouse he works at. It rests on a set of legs about 3 to 3.5 feet long. Hoping to get a better view at the object, he gets within about 200 feet of it, and he switches on his bright lights. Now, in this image here, you kind of see that tree line. Again, this is a modern day image. At that time where that tree line starts, that used to be the road, and that was the first kind of dirt road on his map. And that's basically where he stopped his car, was where that dirt road intersects, and there was a mailbox there, about 200 feet away from the object. Now, he only gets about a good look at the object for about 5 seconds when suddenly a white burst of flame came from the bottom of the object that he described as being like 1,000 flashbulbs going off in your face at once. There was no sound at all. During this burst of white flame, the object shot straight into the air like a bullet, or like just a snap of your fingers. He says he did not actually see the object take off in flight. It just sort of vanished and disappeared in a flash. Now, at about this time, he sees car headlights approaching from the opposite direction that he thinks turns down one of the dirt roads that you can see further down that picture. Meanwhile, where this incident occurred, he says the road is on fire. It burns for roughly 15 to 20 seconds, and it was only about that long. Some reports are a bit inaccurate. A valet's book mentioned the burning lasted for 15 minutes. I don't know if that's a simple typo or what. Valet doesn't tend to get details very often. But it was only about 15 to 20 seconds that it burned. And when it started to burn around, after it dies out, he decides to drive around the object and head straight to South Hill so he can contact the police station. Now, he arrives at the police station at about 9:05 p.m. So this is only a few short minutes after this whole incident happened. And he ends up talking to these two police officers that he tells his story to. He's known these officers for many years. I believe their names was Murphy and Crawford. And he quickly tells them his story. These officers trust him not to tell wild stories because he's a prominent businessman and a member of the community. He's the treasurer of his local South Methodist Church. He is also involved in many other local civic organizations. In fact, the Crowder name is kind of pretty big around South Hill to this day. I was just looking at town hall meetings from last year, and it's just full of the Crowder name. And so he's a pretty prominent name in the community, and people trust him. And so the officers decide to go back with him and check out this site. So they return to this site, and when they arrived, they're met there by two other sheriff deputies. Now, these police were actually the state police, right? They were the Virginia State Police. And he was met by two local sheriff deputies who had heard of the incident over the radio. Now, these four people go over the scene. with the headlights from the police cars and some handheld flashlights that they have. Now, there is another person present. You might wonder who took these photos of the officers. I mean, how did these get in the paper? Well, it's because there was a newspaper man that actually went with Crowder and the police officers back, minutes later to investigate the scene. So they're there investigating this scene with their flashlights, and they find this kidney-shaped black spot on the road about 3 feet at its widest point. Something had ignited the tar in the macadamized road, leaving this burn spot. And it's still hot when the two officers arrive and investigate the scene. After they investigate for a while, it's getting late, and they decide to kind of call it a night. After Crowder left, 2 of the officers actually ended up finding these 4 singed paper matches kind of in the center of the burn spot. And Crowder, at that point, that night, didn't know about the matches they had found yet. Now, Saturday morning, Crowder is heading back into work again. This guy's kind of like me, it seems. He's a bit of a workaholic. He's working 7 days a week, every morning. And so he's heading back to work again, 7 in the morning. And he decides to stop at this guy, Norman Martin's house, Norman Martin is a farmer. And he lives where that red box is, across from a wheat field there. And he wants to see if Martin had seen anything the night before. So he goes to visit him, and there's some conflicting testimony here between Crowder and Martin. Crowder basically asked him if he saw anything last night and unusual, and Martin says no, not really. And so then Crowder proceeded to tell him what happened. And this is where the conflict is. Crowder claims he never told Martin his story first. Martin says that's not true. He told me his story. And then Martin said, well, now that you mention it, I did actually see something. And so after he related the story, Martin told Crowder that he had been visiting a relative with his wife at the hospital in town on Friday evening. And they had returned home at about 8:45 to 9 p.m., which is roughly the time of Crowder's sighting. When his wife went inside, he stood in the driveway for a moment to kind of just take in the view of his the sky and his farm and fields and whatnot. And he's kind of looking up across his wheat field there, north of his wheat field. And he sees this bright light illuminate this large oak tree near the road and another large pine further back from the road. He said the light was extremely bright, and then it seemed to travel up the tree until it eventually kind of went out. He said the light was so bright that he could see a bird, or he could shoot a bird out of the tree. But he also said it looked fairly similar to when cars come out of the driveway of one of the other houses and shine their headlights upon the light. And so at that time, Martin that night didn't think anything that unusual about it. He didn't think it was mysterious or anomalous, and wasn't even going to say or think anything about it. But Crowder got him to tell a story. At this point, the story starts to hit the nationwide press, and this is a case where it's, again, very quick because that reporter was there. This story got out, and by Saturday, the next morning, this paper was around the country. It was in a paper just north of me in Centralia, Washington. The papers in California, papers in Virginia. So it got pretty major nationwide coverage, and several hundred, if not thousands, of people started to show up over on Saturday and Sunday to kind of investigate and see the site for themselves. Meanwhile, the local police and county law enforcement are continuing to do their on-site investigation, and they make a startling discovery that they didn't notice the night before. They discover these impressions in the tarmac where the legs of this object would have been. They are similar to impressions made by football cleats. The problem is the officers swear they could not have missed them the night before, so they didn't notice these impressions on Friday night right after the event happened. They only found them again Saturday morning. And we're still not, and we don't know 100% who actually found them. They could not, people just seem to know they were there. Philip Klass tried to find out who found this impressions, and they could not find actually who was the first person to even find the impressions. But what we do know is that when they looked Friday night, nobody saw them. When they looked Saturday, they found these 4 impressions there. So it's possible that they missed them the night before, only doing the search with their 2 headlights of the cars and their handheld flashlights. But the officers dispute that, saying it would be impossible. They said they actually inspected the ground, inches from the ground, with their flashlights by hand, and they would have seen them. And they did find those small matches. So anyways, they find these impressions there this next day. And these impressions, like I said, they look kind of like a cleat, like you might expect on a football cleat there. Now, at this point, Northwestern University professor and Air Force consultant Jalen Hynek calls Crowder around 5 to 6 p.m. on Saturday to get a statement and to inform Crowder that he would be sending his top assistant, William T. Powers, to investigate the case, and that he would be arriving the following morning, Sunday at 9 a.m. NICAP had actually got the call earlier, around 1:30 p.m. from a local reporter. By 2:30 p.m., they had already dispatched 3 investigators from Washington, D.C. They sent out Gordon Lohr, Don Berliner, and Leon Katchen, who was a physicist at NASA Goddard Space Research Center. After stopping to get the full scoop from the reporter that had tipped them off, they arrived at the Crowder's house at around 7 p.m. They end up interviewing Crowder for about an hour before heading out to the site to take some photos. Now it's late again, so Crowder doesn't stay very long, and he ends up going back home. So they end up heading off back to the police station that Crowder reported to, so they could end up talking to the officers. Now, while they're there, they learn of several more sightings that had taken place in Richmond that Saturday night. Local police officers in South Hill even had their own sighting at about 9:45 p.m. A group of CB radio enthusiasts would also have sightings that night and would chase the lights around in the car. And then they would provide a running commentary of the sightings over the radios. All in total, at least 19 residents in town would end up seeing yellowish looking lights that kind of bobbed up and down that night. Now at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, William T. Powers arrives on the scene in order to investigate. Now, NICAP also returns to the scene. After investigating the CB sighting, they returned to their hotel room at about 2 a.m. and then they showed back up at about the same time as Powers, 9 a.m. to start their investigation again. Powers ends up taking measurements of the burn area and landing marks. Where the machine rested, he finds these spike holes that are about 6 inches apart, 7/8 inch in diameter, and about 1 inch deep. There are 4 feet, and these feet are roughly about 11.5 to 12 feet apart, and the diagonals are about 16.5 and 1 inches and 16.5 and 6 inches. So it's not a perfect square. Powers concludes that the center of gravity is roughly where the fire point is, and notes that the intersection of the diagonals deviates roughly 2 degrees from 90. And this is actually important when it comes to loading, for like a rocket or a craft. And if this craft did have these 4 legs, it was designed pretty badly that it put too much weight on one side. So it wasn't particularly meant for that road or for landing there anyways. So NICAP would find the farmer Norman Martin later that day, and they interviewed him before they headed back to DC in the early afternoon. Gordon Lohr and Don Berliner would end up returning on Tuesday to continue their investigation. Powers sticks around until Monday and does experiments to try and recreate the physical effects. Using kerosene, gasoline, and a blowtorch, he attempts to simulate the black spot, but has little luck. He has various issues, like it releases black smoke instead of the kind of white smoke or flames that he reported. The duration of the burn was off. He had trouble igniting the fuel. And it's important to note that you do need fuel. Tarmac roads don't burn. They won't burn without an external fuel source. You can't just light them on fire and they will continue to burn. They'll only burn as long as the fuel source is present. So this object did burn the road is because it dumped fuel and lit that on fire, not because of the flame of the object. Otherwise, it wouldn't have maintained burning like that. And they consulted with the National Asphalt Institute, or that's not the real name. It's something like that. And the big asphalt conglomerate institute of all the companies on this issue. So they tried to recreate that, and the effects they weren't quite exactly the same. The effects on the tarmac ended up being different as well. The effects of the rock in the tarmac ended up being different. He had a little bit better of effects, a lot in creating these impressions in the road using a jury-rigged impact tester that he created. And again, they had found those matches that I mentioned, and they weren't exactly able to simulate recreating the burning of the matches as well. But finding those matches implies something was burnt and ignited, and that they, it was part of the actual fire. Crowder would dismiss the matches and try and like pass them off as that it was just lots of people came to the site smoking cigarettes. Maybe the police dropped the matches there after they lit up a cigarette. Only the problem is the police say that's impossible. They were the first ones there, and they found them then, like before anyone else showed up to the scene. And that lighting a match to light a cigarette would not burn these matches in the way they were burned. These matches were not just lit and then disposed of. They were part of a fire and singed all the way through. So that's kind of the issue of the matches there. So what are we kind of to think about this case? Crowder, again, he's considered a good member of the community. He's well respected. The police had known him for years and found him completely trustworthy and said he would not lie. We know how that goes, but the general conclusion seems to be that he saw something and was not involved personally with the hoax. William T. Powers would say in his report, as to this writing, therefore, in the absence of any additional clues or the results of chemical analysis, the only conclusion that can be drawn is that the witness probably did see something out of the ordinary, but that we cannot rule out the possibility that a hoax was perpetrated by some person or persons other than the principal witness. A possible hoax is involved, but evidence for it is not clear. And we don't actually get any the results of the tests they took, and they took core samples of the road. They took other samples of the road, and these results were taken to NASA. These samples were taken to NASA Goddard and looked at, and then split up and analyzed a couple other places. And there was nothing kind of remarkable about these road samples to kind of add anything to the case, which always turns out to be the case. It's just pretty normal burn marks. So Blue Book would end up carrying the case as an unidentified while acknowledging that it still could be a hoax. So we are left with an interesting but a mostly single witness sighting with perhaps some corroboration from the farmer Norman Martin, but he never saw an object. He only saw a bright light that seemed to illuminate a tree that he didn't seem to find very mysterious, and said looked much like when car headlights would illuminate the tree. But we have an incident that did leave real physical effects on the road. The burn mark was still warm when they returned with the police minutes later. Impressions were found where the legs would have been. But those impressions were not found until the following day and were either missed the night before or they were added later. If they were not there the night before and they were added Saturday morning, that would sort of imply it certainly was a hoax. But they missed them. Still a bit open. There's also, the matter of the found matches and that were in the center and that seemed to ignite something. The mark on the road is not the kind of mark you would get from some sort of rocket blast. It's the kind of mark you would get from somebody free spilling fuel and igniting it. And the fact that we find those matches is pretty damning. In fact, it was so damning to the police officers that they were pretty much convinced it was a hoax that night, despite continuing to support him in the papers. In fact, the reporter that was there that took the photos after they found the matches was so convinced that it was probably garbage that he wasn't even going to turn in his photos or turn in a story. It was only after talking to the police officer that they felt that Crowder was such a respected man and he saw them taking the photos that he would be mad if he didn't see the photos turn up in the newspaper. So they decided to send the story in. However, the newspaper does not mention finding the matches. It does not mention other details of the story that get left out and then repeated in the Associated Press around the country and the world. But if it is a hoax, and again, this is something that Phil Klass points out in his report, and it's something other people like Charlie Weiser points out in a lot of these cases, is the complete incuriosity of the witness in trying to figure out what's going on. Not only was Crowder non-interested in these matches, he showed little to no interest in the landing marks being found as well. In fact, when they were reported, he was meeting with one of the officers in his office there, only about 1,000 feet away from the scene, and he didn't even leave with the officer to go check them out. In fact, he wouldn't even stop to check them out until he went to lunch later in the day. On that Saturday morning, after he talked to Martin, he didn't even bother to stop at the site to look at it again. You'd think if you had an encounter so amazing like that, you would bother to at least stop and check it out again. But he seemed to have no interest in really looking into any of it at that point, which is kind of weird. But if it is a hoax, who pulled it off and why, right? In such a rural part of the country, like what's the point? Few of any people would end up seeing this hoax. And how did they pull it off? While the preliminary experiments they did to recreate the marks were not completely successful, it is possible with further experiments that they could have recreated these marks using different fuels. Sometime later, in fact, they would find the word PV67 hoax found painted on the side of the road near the burn spot. PV in this case stands for Parkview High School. It's a local high school. And Crowder himself has a teenage daughter that attended. He, however, rejects the idea that it was a high school hoax because it would be far too complicated for a group of high school students to pull off. I personally don't buy the it's too complicated for high schools to pull off argument. But that was his personal belief there. Or maybe Crowder did encounter a vehicle from somewhere else on that Friday evening on that rural Virginia road. It should be noted, though, that he never actually thought it was a vehicle from outer space. He believed that it was a secret government craft of some kind. Why one would be landing in the tobacco country would be anyone's guess. He eventually told Phil Klass that he thought it was a gas-filled bag that would explode, so that was set to explode when the car headlights hit it, and that it was some sort of psychological experiment being performed on him by the military. Why the military would be performing such an experiment on a chemical company fertilizer warehouse manager, again, I'm not entirely sure. He, like I say, he was not really a believer of the whole UFO thing. I found a Facebook post by a Jeff Crowder who said Cliff was actually his great uncle, and he retold this story his entire life, and said the townspeople mocked him over it. Again, I'm not sure why, because he didn't actually attribute anything super strange to it. He actually first thought it was a government craft of some kind, and then he thought it was a gas bag that incinerated. That's not really anything to ridicule anyone over, in my opinion. There was actually, around the same time period, the same day, in fact, in Afraid of Washington, a case that happened. It was not technically the same night, because this case in Virginia happened at 9 p.m. This one happened at 1:30 in the morning. But it was another case of where they were driving on a road, and they had to abruptly slam on the brakes because of this bright object. And they described it basically taking off, vanishing in a blinding light. It's not exactly the same because they see the object later and they say it kind of ends up following the car. But this happened on the same day. In fact, there was a whole kind of rash of sightings that would take off because of this encounter. After Crowder had his sighting, everyone in the region started getting out the binoculars looking for UFOs. And it wasn't a month later where there was another case, and I don't know if it's a copycat or not, but on June 22nd, about 20 minutes north of South Hill in Lunenburg County, there was a case where they found these more imprint marks on the road that they described as being more like horse footprints, or like horseshoes, basically, of some kind, that left these marks, imprints in the road there. So we have a case, again, with imprints in the same area that happened a month later. One might argue that if somebody did perform a hoax, they kind of just were perfecting it or doing a repeat, but who knows? He stuck to his story, and it's a case where something happened. Either there was some sort of real craft, or somebody created a hoax, because there were real effects. So it's pretty interesting case. There's a lot more details that I don't really go into because for time, but I'll be free to answer any questions if anybody has them. I believe it's back to Rachel and Louise.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, my mic. Today I'm going to talk about nuclear rocketry. And could we make the slides here bigger, Rachel? Thanks. These are two books by James Dewar, who is, he used to work for, I think, Lanol and other government research facilities. But he spells out the case for nuclear rockets, nuclear thermal rockets. So henceforth NTR in this video. Two books by him here, To the End of the Solar System, and then The Nuclear Rocket, Making Our Planet Green, Peaceful and Prosperous, which this topic might seem ironic because I previously had talked about an article by Sarah Scold in Scientific American, where she looked into the drawbacks of space exploration. Basically, now I'm going to go in the opposite track, and I'm going to assume that space exploration and colonization are good things, and try to make the case that only nuclear rockets or NTRs can make that feasible. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is a Nova engine. So this is a solid nuclear rocket core engine, the most basic type actually. And it's basically just you're pushing fuel like a molecular hydrogen through veins or spaces in this reactor core and heating it up a lot and then spewing the heated gas out the other side. You don't need any oxidizer for this, so this is not the same as chemical combustion. This is just purely thermal heating of the gas and then expelling at a very high speed. So that means that you don't need any oxidizer, which increases your fuel fraction, so your payload fraction, I'm sorry. So the fraction of the payload mass that you can carry on that rocket, okay? So that's the main benefit there. Sorry, I'm just gonna put my battery in. Oops, sorry guys, 1 second. Sorry about that. So this is a really basic type of nuclear rocket. So Rover, Nova, or Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application. This was a program that ran from 1955 to 1973. It was run jointly by the Atomic Energy Commission, which is nowadays known as the Department of Energy, and also NASA was involved, and Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory was involved as well to investigate the feasibility and basics of using nuclear thermal rockets. The Soviet Union also had its own NTR research program, and the Soviets produced some novel concepts and prototypes of their own. Now, no nuclear thermal rocket has ever been flown, but these are the ones which have been tested on Earth on rigs. So the benefits of NTR and the sort of a private enterprise / government partnership that James Dewar advocates for in the book, in the two books that he wrote, you get higher specific impulse, which is a measure of rocket efficiency. Basically, how much mass can you use to change the velocity of the rocket? The less mass you need, the more efficient the rocket is. So this is one of the benefits of NTRs. Higher power density. So power density is how much power you can get from a given area or volume. Higher payload fraction, as I mentioned. The higher the temperature that can be achieved, the faster the propellant can be expelled out of the rocket and the better the performance. So we'll see a couple of examples of proposed gas core nuclear rockets in a moment, but those will be even more efficient. Larger investment pool, not dependent on election and federal budget cycles. So the type of business model that he advocates would call for a large basically holding company type setup where people can invest into the program, and so can governments and private companies around the world, and then they would get a direct return on investment. So this would not be dependent on elections and federal budget cycles. Broader societal participation, the more people you have investing, the more money can come in, the more direct benefits can come from the program, and not just trickle down effect from, spin-offs of technology, although there have been many of those, but, we're talking about direct benefits to investors. And true prospect of routine solar system exploration, as well as colonization. The term colonization, of course, has taken on a negative correlation, but Dewar is using it in a more positive sense. Now let's go to the next slide. Democratization and dominion. This is the motto that he uses. So what does that mean? Democratization in this context means more people participating. So it's not just like an elite stratum of society, the super rich or the government. It's more and more people buying into this. And dominion of the solar system by humanity. So the true prospect of fanning out into the solar system and using its resources and achieving permanent human habitations out there. Okay, so in other words, routine space travel and deep space travel. So the next slide, this is a test rig at the Jackass Flats near the Nevada test site, or well, it's called the Nevada Nuclear or National Security Site now, but it used to be called the Nevada Test Site. This is an adjacent site here, Area 25, because there's different areas which are allocated. So Area 51, of course, is the most famous, but that's also adjacent to the NTS. At Jackass Flats is where they had the rover and Nova program test rigs. So they had these rockets which were fixed in place, so nothing was launched, but they would sometimes fire into vacuum chambers or sometimes into the atmosphere, with an upside down firing rocket. So they had many of these test rigs. They would measure the performance and things like that. So some drawbacks, radiation issue, of course, the one that people are afraid of. There's a widespread opposition in society to nuclear power because of the radiation risk. But according to Dewar, this can be ameliorated, if not entirely, eliminated, with proper program management, containment protocols, and using optimal launch points so that if something does fail as it's launching off, it can crash somewhere like in the ocean where it's going to be not that much of a threat to people. Safety concerns should not form the basis for alarmist and defeatist opposition on the basis of so-called green concerns. Talk about nuclear accidents from space and how they give us, that was a note to myself. But nuclear accidents from space, like some of the Cosmos re-entries by Soviet satellites, they had nuclear, not engines, but energy units to run their electricity. Those would sometimes re-enter prematurely, and one of them crashed into Canada, and a few others. There were a few other scares involved. But even those, they ultimately didn't pose that much of a threat to people. They were contained, and the material was basically carted away. And the Soviets did eventually give more focus to safety. So if you have proper safety protocols, then probably this can be contained to an acceptable level. But you're not going to eliminate the risk entirely. Now, the other point that Dewar makes is that, in fact, NTR is needed for the space program to be truly green, with vastly improved economies of scale. More Earth system science missions can be launched, and so that's got benefits for the environment. And also, to the extent that rocket emissions from chemical rockets are bad for the environment, this can be largely eliminated by getting rid of the oxidizer, because NTRs don't need an oxidizer. He also recommends an infrastructure-centric approach, which will allow mission profiles to be refined, expanded, and concretized after the necessary resources, expertise, and systems become known quantities, rather than being tied up by the requirements of a specific mission type. So, building up the infrastructure, knowing how things work, what the optimal ways of doing things are, and then that's going to make possible missions. So he draws analogies to the adoption and expansion of railroads and shipping, noting that a large initial government investment was necessary to get the ball rolling and to help put in place some basic infrastructure to make investment by private enterprise more attractive. So there is going to be a large upfront cost, but then private enterprise, the idea goes, will become more and more at the forefront, and the government's role will recede into the background. So when private enterprise saw the benefits of railroads, shipping, etc., it went all in and the government's role receded. The point is, having a strong infrastructure in place will allow experience in processes to mature and evolve, with non-government actors being largely left to work out the most profitable uses for NTR. Make no mistake, the nuclear corporation that James Dewar proposes is very much a for-profit enterprise, and it has to be. So that's the point, to attract investors so that they will be motivated to put up more investment, with some of the returns being recycled into the development of more advanced NTRs and so on. This is another test rig. This one's firing into the atmosphere. Again, this one is at area 25. Oops. So another motto that he uses, if you can pay, we will launch. This sums it up well. Dewar also recommends that the infrastructure help nurture a series of initial generations of nuclear engines, which with what he calls recore and reuse engines, the former being used to reach low Earth orbit or LEO, the latter being used to stage from it and into various zones in the solar system. Eventually, propellants will be stored in LEO in space depots, providing liquid hydrogen propellant once the infrastructure in space has been sufficiently matured. Each recore and reuse engine will be deorbited after so many firings, with some components refurbished, though some engines near the end of their life could be sent on a final hurrah and used on an interplanetary space mission or science mission. Generations 1 through 4 of the recore and reuse engines will be variations of solid core engines. So the type that was tested at the Nevada test site or near the Nevada test site by Rover and Nova. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is just a rundown of the Project Rover firings that happened. So the reactors, you got the Kiwi, the variants of the Kiwi reactors, Phoebus, Peewee, and NF1. And then you've got the Nova reactors and their performance stats, so average full power, flow rate, etc., vacuum specific impulse. So those are like basically twice as efficient as chemical rockets. Even today, chemical rockets have not become much more efficient than they used to be in the 1960s. So if we're doing chemical rocketry, we're really just dealing with increments of performance, but nuclear engines have the potential to really bring down the costs per pound or kilogram that you want to put into orbit. So that's the benefit there. So the beginning of the program, rockets would be launched from a modified cargo plane to make the idea of NTR more palatable to the public and to start to mature the technology and infrastructure. But nuclear engines themselves will eventually be fired from the ground using a single stage to orbit vehicle or SSTO, which will achieve maximum returns on investment. If we go to the next slide, this is a concept from the 1960s by Robert Buzzard or Buzzard of Buzzard, what was that? Buzzard rocket. I think that idea about a stellar rocket that came from him, but this is a different thing here. This is just an SSTO concept. It's like a space plane that can launch and then come back down. and it can be reused again and again. It's got a nuclear core that you can throw out and replace after so many firings. And the idea is that because of the inherent efficiency of these nuclear rockets, you would have, even if you don't have like a huge amount per launch, the cost per kilogram or pound is going to be way lower than for chemical rockets, right? And apparently this SSTO is the most efficient configuration. But that will be for the foreseeable future, but you'd have to go through initial generations of recore and reuse engines first. But this is the dream, really. But the solid core engine is not the final word, because then you would have a liquid core. So when NASA terminated NOVA, it adopted a politically correct prohibition on ground-fired NTRs. But once the dollar value is seen by polities around the world, opposition to such technology will change into fervent endorsement. Even within the category of solid core engines, substantial improvements in performance may be possible before reaching an absolute limit imposed by physics. Later generations of NTRs will be, if technology allows, even more efficient. The liquid and gas core engines. This is showing some concepts for gas core nuclear rockets, which the point here is just that you're increasing the temperature experienced by the propellant. So on the right there, you can see 55,000 Kelvin, right, which is really, really hot. So the higher you can get the temperature, the faster you can expel the propellant, the more efficient the engine is. This has not been done yet, but this is probably something that could be done in the future at some point. And of course, the investments from the private government partnership could go into the development of these rockets. So these sorts of liquid and gas core engines offer far greater improvements in performance, even above the solid core, which is more efficient than chemical rockets. In the far future, fusion and antimatter engines may be possible, though these are still very much at the theoretical stages and may not be possible at all. So we don't know if they are possible, but they conceivably might be. But those are definitely for the far future. If they are possible, much of the infrastructure for their use and for making their use profitable will have already been in place. Unless humanity applies the nuclear hammer, as James Dewar phrases it, it will not engage in routine space exploration and colonization of the solar system, tinkering around on the margins by seeking marginal gains in performance with chemical rockets, even with supposedly reusable ones, will ensure that space access will remain elitist and that taxpayers will only receive trickle-down indirect benefits instead of direct returns on investment. The whole equation and mindset changes when citizens and companies see the direct financial benefits for themselves. NTRs will allow for broader participation by many constituencies, universities, schools, Earth system scientists, private companies, private investors, entertainment, space manufacturing, and many others that we haven't even thought of through their investment, R&D and submission of space missions and probes, and it will thereby allow democratization of space travel. The nuclear corporation will expand the tax base. The government's involvement in the nuclear corporation will generally recede into the background as more functions are taken over by private companies, but it will continue to provide some crucial services such as security and regulation. The lower the government's overall financial burden, the less it will have to compete with other budget items. But the more the corporation grows and the greater the tax base it provides, the greater its benefits to the general welfare. There could also be benefits for world peace. Initially, the corporation would be an American one, but it would evolve to draw in other countries and peoples. The shift towards space could further alter humanity's mindset in seeing itself as a spacefaring species, potentially alleviating petty parochial squabbles on Earth. Rogue states who want to see benefits from the nuclear corporation would have to buy into it, and they would be obliged to use the nuclear rockets on offer to launch their payloads. continued use of chemical rockets would draw suspicion from other countries. These states would also have to give up their stockpiles of fissile material, for example. And he also goes into some discussion about like what would happen to America's excess plutonium and unprocessed fissile material. So there's going to be benefits there as well. Next slide, please. This is a concept by NASA. So NASA is again looking into this concept after a hiatus of many decades, but bringing things closer to the present. Information about NASA's nuclear rocket aspirations can be found on their website. They are currently getting back into NTR research. Congress has allocated $125 million, which is not enough, but it's at least a start. Let's go to the next one. This is another concept, a demonstration rocket for agile cislunar operations, or DRACO concept. So we'll see as well what the future brings for Russian and Chinese interest in this technology. I suspect that they'll get in on the game once they see NASA and American companies making progress in this field. So, by the way, here are some UFO tie-ins with nuclear rockets and engines. So the next slide is going to show Stanton Friedman, eminent ufologist, a late ufologist. He was a believer in the ET hypothesis for UFOs. He actually did work on NERVA as a young scientist back in the day. He would often draw upon that experience in his books about UFOs to illustrate the idea that spacefaring extraterrestrials will not just rely on a Voyager-style space probe or means of getting here to our solar system. They would use active propulsion. Although, like, the extent to which he drew on NERVA, I think, was a bit too much. But anyway, it's true that NERVA would, if it had matured, it would have provided more benefits that we would see now, and maybe even to really deep space exploration like the Voyager type. But anyway, he did draw on that experience. The Cash Landrum case, by the way, touted radiation sickness as a result of exposure. Might as well go to the next slide, Rachel, since that shows a picture of the Cash Landrum UFO, or what they reported seeing. The sort of diamond-shaped spacecraft or aircraft that they reported with the helicopters buzzing around. Now, this case is sort of famous because of the so-called radiation sickness symptoms that were exhibited by the witnesses. They and many others have taken the craft to be something that the government was testing. However, the cause for the symptoms expressed by Cash and Landrum could not have been caused by ionizing radiation, because for them to have gotten those symptoms from radiation would have meant that they would have received a lethal dose, so they would have died. Their symptoms were almost certainly caused by other things like alopecia, cataracts. Old people get cataracts, so it probably had nothing to do with the actual case. Many other problems with the case as well. No scorch marks were found on the road. The vinyl was not melted on the dashboard of the car, and the medical records, I think, of Landrum have never been released, so we can't really judge that. By the way, Bob Lazar, famous UFO fabulist, in his infinite wisdom via plagiarism, he tried to actually fold the Cash Landrum case into his own story in an early interview with Michael Lindemann back in the early 90s, recorded in Lindemann's book, The UFO Experience. Lazar claimed that the Cash Landrum UFO was probably using plutonium instead of element 115. And so therefore, it was representing a kind of crude copy of alien propulsion technology. Of course, since the Cash Landrum case took place in 1980, it would mean that the people in charge of the reverse engineering program must have already known what the alien fuel, element 115 in Lazar's story, was by that point, especially because they also would have known about the gravity manipulation capabilities of the spacecraft. So if they could copy that, then they could surely would have known about the alien element way before Lazar ever arrived at S4, the place near Area 51, which he says that the alien craft were kept at. He says that his only contribution to the program at S4 was to determine the element, but that doesn't really make any sense for the reasons I just noted. So Lazar also says that says he determined that it was element 114 or 115 in the interview. He also describes the alien reactor as using antimatter and gravity manipulation. Of course, that was already a staple of science fiction through Star Trek. Gravity manipulation has also been a staple of UFO lore for decades before Lazar ever arrived on the UFO scene. Let's go to the last slide, please. The Gosford 1994 case. Jeff probably knows more about this than I do, but there have been these cases which happen like over water, where sometimes the UFO is sort of drawing water into itself. And maybe this is sort of inspired by the fact that water contains hydrogen, which could be used in nuclear fusion. Okay, so maybe that's where the idea is coming from. Whatever these witnesses actually saw, or whether these witnesses actually saw alien craft utilizing this physical principle or assimilated something they heard about it, like nuclear fusion, well, you can probably guess my position, but that's about it from me. So back to you, Rachel.
Rachel, you're muted.
I am sorry. Thank you. Okay. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting for fear of little men. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather. Down along the rocky shore, some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam. Some in the reeds of the black mountain lake, with frogs for their watchdog, with frogs for their watchdogs, all night awake. That's the beginning of The Fairies from William Allingham's 1850 poems. Despite its seemingly friendly opening, the poem quickly turns dark, describing how a girl named Bridget is abducted for 7 years to the fairy realm and then returned dead from sorrow. The fairies, Allingham writes, quote, thought she was fast asleep, unquote. She's then kept deep inside lakes. What does it mean that the fairies eat crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam? It reminds me of Joe Simonton's pancakes, which Jeff discussed in the last episode. Hat tip to him for bringing my attention to this line in the poem. The poem suggests that sea foam is in some way enchanted, or perhaps that it nourishes enchantment, but a dark enchantment associated with danger, death, and sorrow. Sea foam is common in religious literature, art, fairy tales, and folklore around the world. Before moving to this next example, just a warning, it gets pretty graphic and sexual pretty quick. In Hesiod's Theogony, written in the 8th century BCE, Gaia, the goddess of the earth, who is described by the text as wicked, is angry with Uranos, god of the sky. This is because he hates some of his children and hides them inside of the earth. So at her behest, Cronus cuts off the genitals of Uranos, as Uranos covers Gaia in the night to sleep with her. From the blood of Uranos, Gaia births the Erinyes or Furies, and the tree nymphs called Melii in Hesiod's telling. Meanwhile, quote, soon after the genitals were cut by the sickle and thrown into the agitated sea, they were carried through the water for a long time, and a white foam sprang from the deathless flesh, and inside grew a young woman. First she came to sacred Cuthera, and then to sea-bathed Cyprus, where a beautiful goddess emerged with grass growing around her slender feet. Gods and mortals called her Aphrodite, for she was born from the sea foam, and fair-crowned Cutherea, for she reached Cuthera, and also Cuprogenes, for she was born on sea-bathed Cyprus, and Philomedes, for she sprang from genitals. Eros followed her, and fair Hemeros stayed with her from the moment she was born until she joined the race of the gods. She had this honor from the beginning and obtained by lot from humans and immortal gods the secrets, smiles, deceptions, sweet delights, friendliness, and gentleness of young women. Unquote. Hesiod, what were you thinking? This is a terrible Mother's Day story. Okay, I didn't write this for Mother's Day anyway. That's from a 2021 translation by Michael Hoyman, of whom I know very little else about. But it seemed to work well here, as in this myth, sea foam is sometimes a creative force with clear sexual connotations surrounding it. Though the sea foam itself often plays a procreative role, there is something male or masculine about many of these stories. As it turns out, that's because they often have portrayals of male characters operating phallic-looking weapons to create sea foam or in combination with sea foam. In the case of Cronus, this even involves castration. On the other hand, sea foam may also be a tricky force associated with demons out to deceive and exploit. In a folk tale about the creation of the land recounted from Bukovina, the devil first appears to God in a solid piece of sea foam on the ocean. This could be interpreted in light of the Epistle of Jude, in which it says of ungodly people, quote, they are wild waves of the sea, foaming up their shame, unquote. In any case, in the story, the devil tricks God into creating the land. This is also a rare instance where we are treated to sea foam in the heavens, as the devil is taken into the sky. The Phoenician philosopher Porphyry tells another version of this story in which Satanael is portrayed as a diving bird. This story is also reminiscent of two very different stories from Japan. In the Kojiki, a 712 foundational Shinto work that contains early Japanese myths and legends, the island of Onogoro is created from the froth dripping from a spear after the spear has stirred the sea. And from a perhaps later story, a folk tale, a carpenter tries to rebuild a bridge that keeps falling down. An ogre called Oniroku appears to him in the foam floating on the surface of the river and says he'll help the carpenter rebuild the bridge so that it won't fall again in exchange for his eyeballs. The carpenter can only escape this fate, though, if he can guess the demon's name. There's something very UFO adjacent about that kind of situation. Oniroku spends part of the story unidentified by name, and identifying him prevents the carpenter's blindness. In another ancient myth from South Asia, Indra slays the powerful serpent demon called Vritra. In the version of this story from the Mahabharata, he does this with the use of sea foam combined with his thunderbolt. The foam is effective, according to this account, because it doesn't belong to any of the four ancient elements. It is neither wet nor is it dry. It's frothy. In the fairy tale The Little Mermaid, written by Hans Christian Andersen and first published in 1837, sea foam plays a very important role in the story. This is because when mermaids die, they dissolve into sea foam, and their soul also dies. The heroine of this story, the Little Mermaid, has the opportunity to return from the human world to her life under the sea by killing the man she loves, but she can't do it. She casts the knife into the ocean, and, quote, the water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted up looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half-fainting glance at the prince, and then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and thought her body was dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and his warm rays fell on the cold foam of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun, and all around her floated hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings. She could see through them the white sails of the ship and the red clouds in the sky. Their speech was melodious, but too ethereal to be heard by mortal ears, as though they were also seen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and that she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and her voice sounded ethereal, as the voice of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. Unquote. Because of her good deeds, LM is rescued from dissolving into sea foam at the moment of her death. She's lifted into the realm of air spirits, who are given 300 years to earn a human soul by doing good deeds and bringing life-restoring air to people in need. Andersen places the role of sea foam as the end of life and the beginning of a strange afterlife. In the act of turning into sea foam, LM is instantly transmuted into air. Thus, she is transmuted from a sea spirit into an air spirit. Unlike in many of the above accounts, with the possible exception of Vritra's death, sea foam serves directly as a passage from the world of the living to the world beyond. It acts as the literal vehicle for the Little Mermaid's travel from the Earth world to the Sky world. And in this travel between worlds, she meets and even becomes like other beings who live in the sky. So we can liken sea foam to flying saucers in a narrative sense, because just as flying saucer lore involves aliens and travel to other worlds by means of flying saucers and other spacecraft, the Little Mermaid travels to the world of humans and of air spirits by shape-shifting, but when she travels into the sky, she does so by means of sea foam, where she encounters the sky's inhabitants, transparent beings who can influence the wind and who speak in an ethereal language. They serve in this story as analogs of UFO aliens, while sea foam serves as the vehicle from one world to another, just like a flying saucer. But what is sea foam? I became interested in sea foam last year when I began wondering if there were naturally occurring spheres that fly through the sky carried by the wind, like naturally occurring balloons, i.e., natural bubbles floating in the air. So far, I have found 2 examples of things similar to this, but not quite identical. Okay. Perhaps the weirdest example is of the bubbles that are formed from the bubble bush or Barbados nut tree, Jatropha curcas, endemic to the tropics of the Americas. One can take a stem and snap it, and then blow bubbles from the oily sap inside, which shares chemical properties with soap suds. The same substance is used and the production of biofuel. So far, however, the bubble bush bubbles are the only example I've found of naturally occurring individual spherical bubbles, and even then, the only known cases I found so far were video recordings, all examples of bubbles produced by people intervening to deliberately snap the stem and blow the bubbles. Therefore, they are made by human hands. Listeners, please let me know in the comments if you happen to be aware of any examples of individual bubbles that float in the air naturally without any kind of human intervention. The only other example that I found is natural, does float in the air by being carried by wind, and is somehow quite magical. But it doesn't occur in the form of individual spherical bubbles, and that is, of course, sea foam, or potentially foam on rivers or lakes. Really, any naturally occurring foam that's light enough will do. Unlike soap bubbles or bubble bush bubbles, foam is often much more stable because it's made up of many small bubbles, all stuck together. Likely for this very reason, sea foam, along with other sorts of liquid foams, is actually pretty common. There are wide varieties of foam that form from different materials floating in liquids, and foam will form under various different circumstances. While many aquatic foams are produced by industrial waste, many others are produced from organic material like soil or algae. Sometimes toxic algal blooms will result in large floods of foam. Some foam might even be produced by minerals like particles of silicon or heavy metals. Foam has many names, just in English alone. Spume, froth, scum, surf, suds, and fizz are a few. Sea foam is just one class of foams. Foam doesn't happen just in pure water, and not all substances in water can help produce foam. It arises in the interface between the air and the water, or what is called the surface microlayer in Star Trek Technobabble. This is the surface between the water and air, and it's where particles, debris, and microorganisms can collect from both above and below. In particular, surfactants will collect in this layer. These are molecules that are repelled by water on one end and attracted to water on the other end. When this layer gets agitated by waves, wind, rapid force, etc., it forms small bubbles that these surfactants help keep from popping immediately. The foam that results tends to collect stuff from the water like contaminants or organic matter, sort of like a sponge. So foam can actually help naturally cleanse bodies of water, but it can also be dangerous if it contains a lot of toxic materials. As a result, governments sometimes have to pass laws regulating industrial foam production. Because of how common and diverse sea foam and aquatic foams are, they actually help shape ecosystems. Not only can some sea foams be toxic and dangerous for life to be around, some can also be a source of food and serve as their own very own self-contained habitats for tiny critters. Much like in the stories, sea foam in real life is a protective and potentially deadly substrate, a sort of miniature and intermediate realm marked both by birth and by death. So it's only natural that scientists study it extensively, as shown in the paper by Katharina Schilling and Matthias Zessner, Foam in the Aquatic Environment, which I relied on heavily for this piece, and which looks at a lot of research that's been done on the topic. Another paper was published on May Day in the journal Marine Environmental Research, which looks at how a particular species of periwinkle, a type of sea snail, responds to marine foams. Apparently, these foams cause the periwinkles to increase their metabolism and become more active, or else they will simply avoid the spume entirely, according to this new study. But the question on all of our minds, or at least the question on my mind, is there ever a U-foam? Can sea foam result in UFO sightings? And what I mean by this is, can people ever spot sea foam flying through the air, have no idea what it is, and then report it as a UFO or even a fleet of UFOs? And I would also add to this question two more. One, does flying sea foam ever in fact get unknowingly reported as a UFO? And two, are there truly unconventional forms of flying sea foams uncharted by science? But I won't keep you in suspense. At least I won't to some small extent. I will largely be keeping you in suspense. Setting our first question aside for a moment, I do not have answers to these last two questions. It would take a great deal of time and effort to locate and positively identify flying sea foam in the annals of UFO reports and other accounts of aerial marvels. Only if we can positively correlate a report's features with those of flying sea foam, and we can show that there was a large body of sea foam nearby that was in fact being carried to an altitude of yards or perhaps more in the air, can we say, yes, there is a UFO report that in all probability can be explained by flying sea foam. It's a hard ask, but it's one I find fascinating. Question number two is all the more difficult to answer because we might not even know what we're looking for. Sea foam is diverse in both kind and in behavior. I haven't found any scientific literature specifically on the topic of flying sea foam. So who's to say how diverse flying sea foam even is, and also what sorts of behaviors it might have? For example, does flying sea foam ever burn while flying? Does it ever contain lighter than air gases that allow it to float upwards into the air without being propelled by the wind? What happens when it gets ionized? Could there be plasma sea foams? These questions can't be answered simply through report collection, but they would also require field documentation, or at the very least, experimental demonstration. That is, either field scientists would have to film and capture examples of exotic flying sea foams, or else they would have to create flying sea foams using conditions that replicate natural ones. Now, let's return to our first question, though. Can people see flying sea foam, and can this result in a UFO report? And the answer to this question is yes, but with a caveat. First of all, people can and do see sea foam, so yes, people can mistake flying sea foam for a UFO in theory. It just has never been documented. Because first of all, sea foam does fly, and it can do so in quantity. There are many well-documented instances of sea foam floods, where a storm causes large amounts of the stuff to fill bays, beaches, or coastal towns. In early April, a nor'easter hit the coast of Massachusetts and also brought with it floods of sea foam that blanketed coastal towns like Marshmallow. Sheets of sea foam can even be deadly. In 2020, 5 experienced surfers tragically lost their lives when they got caught in algal sea foam while surfing in The Hague in the Netherlands. Oh, this is the wrong video. Hold on a second. Sorry. Okay. There we go. There it is. In February, So wind can also simply pick up bits, clouds, or even big clumps of foam and simply carry it right up into the air. In February of this year, spume was whipped up into the air in Santa Cruz, California, as seen in this video. And here we go. No? Oh, there it is. All right. In this video, someone posted in 2014, you can see sea foam as it gets picked up momentarily in eddies of wind. It causes me to wonder what would happen if a sea foam flood was hit by a small whirlwind, which then dragged sea foam in a vortex over land. And I've got one more for y'all. Okay. This one is my favorite. All right. Now, this video shows a thick flood of sea foam that entrenched the streets of Aberdeen in 2012. One can clearly see a big old blob of sea foam shooting straight up out of frame and beyond the height of the buildings. I want to wait for it here. I don't want to leave out the best part. Okay, it's about to watch. Oh, there it goes. Did you see that? All right. So, it's quite clear that sea foam can form into fairly sizable objects and it can be carried by the wind with ease. According to Schilling and Zessner, hardier sea foam can last for hours before falling apart completely. So the question is only really how far inland the sea foam can get carried before completely disappearing, or alternatively, how close can someone get to a sea foam flood without being aware of its presence? If someone witnesses flying chunks of sea foam far inland, or for some other reason without any indicators of any sea foam being present nearby, especially any foam of a kind that is particularly unusual in its color or properties, or even simply viewed in an unusual light like the light of the sunset, it seems to me quite plausible that they could come away convinced that they saw a shape-shifting UFO from outer space or some other unseen realm. Seafoam chunks can fly in large numbers, change shape, and dissipate. And if that seafoam happens to be of a kind that science has never described, then we're basically talking about a bona fide Heinekian UFO. Am I speculating? A little bit, yes. But not so far out of reason that not so far outside of reason that these don't make for reasonable hypotheses. Well within the realm of possibility. So why should you care about seafoam? Why I think this all matters, seafoam and the like, is that seafoam is basically a part of the UFO myth. But I don't mean what other people mean by UFO myth here. What I mean by the UFO myth is not the myth of a secret government program that collects crashed UFO debris. No, that's really just one small, itsy-bitsy, tiny myth that emerged in modern culture and sort of just became really popular through comics, movies, newspapers, and popular books. No, I'm talking about a UFO myth that's always existed in many different parts of the world, the myth of the oversaucer. Mic drop. That's right, folks, I'm talking about all of the myths of any sort of other entities living in any other sort of realm, oftentimes flying, oftentimes donning the shape of a flying light or a flying animal, oftentimes even abducting people or in some other way transporting them to another realm. Before saucer lore, it was Fort's Super Sargasso Sea. Before that, it was airships and mysterious airship pilots. Before that, it was spirits, enchanted beings, and gods. Really, it still is all that other stuff. And what everyone refers to as the quote-unquote UFO truth is just a very small part of that much vaster, much more ancient over-saucer lore, in parts largely forgotten and in parts unknown because it hasn't even been created yet. You see, the over-saucer is not itself a saucer, it's something far vaster and darker, which fully surrounds and dwarfs all saucers. What's most interesting is not that we can replace the saucers and NHI narrative with an entirely different one of seafoam and entities of pretty much any kind. It's that we can replace it with any of countless other comparable narratives that have existed since the beginning of history all over the world, or even just new ones that we make up. Like Anderson, we can tailor these myths to suit our needs. Time-traveling airships and Verne-esque inventors, witch lights and witches, spook lights and spooks, gods and chariots of said gods, sundry extremely rare preternatural phenomena hiding in the noise, and the witnesses themselves, flying pancakes and tiny pancake makers that fly atop them, were-owls, lighter-than-air algal balloons piloted by crabs, sky fungus and ball lightning, the sky's Olympkin, and so forth. Seafoam is just one example of a new narrative, but it's also not an entirely arbitrary one or even a new one. Just as saucers are emblematic of the sky and aliens, seafoam is emblematic of birth and death and an unfathomable realm that may be inhabited by or even give birth to demons, gods, and spirits. Like UFO lore, seafoam lore can be tailored to suit our needs. It can even be a symbol of rebirth like the phoenix, and it is in the end something that's a bit mysterious in our skies. It's an example of something that could plausibly be seen by someone and reported as a close encounter sighting of a glistening red shape-shifting UFO, or even a fleet of UFOs at sunset. What other mysterious things can be seen in the sky? After all, regardless of what happens or whatever any disclosure bro says, there will always be uncountable natural mysteries further west. Nature is a stranger yet. The ones that cite her most have never passed her haunted house nor simplified her ghost. To pity those that know her not is helped by the regret that those who know her less the nearer her they get. Emily Dickinson. You'll have to unmute your mic, Jeff. I can't do it for you. I'm sorry.
I want some seafoam pancakes now. Nice and salty. But, it's kind of weird. Like, I thought, if food is from seafoam would be salty, and I thought fairy food didn't have salt in it. So what's up with that?
Well, it's all lies. It's all the stories about fairies are lies.
It's pretty interesting. Louise had to leave us. That's okay. I also say for people that are a bit confused why videos were not playing when Rachel thought videos were playing, it's because they actually were playing, but backstage. Rachel, you forgot to put them on stage.
Oh,
so that last one that did go on stage, I added that last second, real quick. I put it on stage for you. I'm sorry. I should have thought of doing that earlier. I just wasn't sure if you wanted me to share your screen or not like that. So I didn't.
I'm so sorry. Dang it.
But I'm sure she'll link to them in the notes or scripts or something, maybe to those.
Yeah. And I might even go back and just throw them back in there in Blender.
and add them up or something. Yeah. That's okay. We're still getting the hang of it, we're amateurs, so
That's true. And yeah, we're amateurs. I am not an expert at doing this or an expert about what on the topics that I discuss. No way am I an expert, people.
and I still get lost, sometimes when because I go off my script a bit, and then I forget where exactly I was, to start back up again. But we're getting the hang of it. Bear with us.
Yes,
So
please do bear with us, the people from the future.
Interesting discussion today. I forgot to mention, like I say, if you guys want to learn more about the case, be sure to check out the thread, because there's a lot of stuff there, and I've linked to it on Twitter, and I'll share it on the Discord and on Facebook and stuff as well, because there's several other people that investigated this sighting too, so you can read their reports. So there's not only just the William Powers report you can check out, there's the NICAP report. There's actually two other people from NICAP that showed up. There's a Ricketts report, who is also a NICAP guy, and there was also an engineer named Morris who came and did his own investigation, that he wrote a little report. So there's so much more you can learn about this case in the threads that you can check out online that I provided. And I have added stuff to it literally just this morning, since I originally did this case back a couple weeks ago. So plenty for you guys to learn if you want to know all the other weird little details, like the alleged story of an Air Force officer showing up in a car with his family out of the blue on Sunday afternoon to get the scoop, and then leaving with his attaché and his family in the back seat again. All sorts of other little weird details, so. And there's a bit of, and also like right now, one of the main cases people are talking about on Twitter is that Langley Air Force Base drone case. A Langley Air Force Base officer actually came and investigated this case, back in 1967, because that's in Virginia, not all that far away. In fact, some of the sightings that the people thought they saw in town on Saturday were, if you paid attention to the news clip that was on the screen, were actually attributed to flares, because this military base camp, I forget the name, Skeelan or something like that, Camp P something, is just like 20-30 miles away, and they were doing exercises, and so that's how they explained away some of those other sightings that happened the next day. But there's always so much more you could go into, but we have limited time, and we're almost at an hour and 40 minutes now, running up on it. So
yeah, I didn't really think about the length of my piece until today. So I think in the future, I'm going to really try to cut down on the length of my pieces. And I wrote that all last week. So yeah, it was not my plan to put that up on Mother's Day, but I thought it was, I don't know. I liked it. I liked my piece.
Reminder to call your mother. I was going to do it before the show, but then I forgot, so I've got to give her a call here before it gets too late here. So call your mother.
Yes, everybody out there listening, if you happen to see this on Mother's Day, please call your mothers, or even if it's,
or if you see it later in the week and you forgot to call your mother and you haven't called her yet, you better pick up the phone and call your mom.
Yeah, in that case, it's like, what are you even doing? You just call your mom now.
Yeah.
Come on, people.
Exactly. Did you have another thing, a section to wrap up?
Yes, I do indeed. And for our final story, the sky over Flagstaff was empty today. UFO watchers in Flagstaff, Arizona reported an eerie lack of UFOs in the skies today. One witness, who chose to remain anonymous, said that they found the lack of UFOs to be ominous, wondering if they were perhaps hiding inside of clouds. Said non-UFO witness Jordan Bailey, quote, "It's almost as if the sky itself is a UFO," unquote. Before you go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos or you just like hitting buttons. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. One moment, please. Oh, come on. Sorry, people. Thank you for waiting. Oh, there it is. Okay. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel. All of the videos there were made by me and not by the fictional character Telesma Blue Orb. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, and you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he doesn't make any money off of it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. And please also say hello to Dorothy, the cutie pie. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everyone, for watching. In the words of the disc, keep watching the skies. Don't look behind you.
Keep spinning.